Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. I feel like a bit of a, well, I would have, except there's one gentleman there with a tie on, so I can't say, without being undiplomatic, I feel like a bit of a dill standing here with a tie and a suit on. But for somehow or other, I got the impression that I should at least have a jacket and tie, and it turns out that I'm only wearing a suit because the suit trousers are comfortable fit and none of the other trousers are. But anyway, well look, it's lovely to be here. Yeah, this is the structure of this book is that really it's two books or two great narratives that have been, as far as possible, interwoven. And of course, I say somewhere, and I say to people about it regularly, that's how it was in the first place, because one of the stories is the Australians fighting in the Great War, and the other story is the Great War itself, that vast canvas, and so that's what's going on with this book. So it gives you a concise narrative of the Great War. It doesn't try to reach into every little corner of it and what was happening in East Africa and so on, but the major theatres of the First World War, it gives a concise narrative, an analysis of that great canvas, and then in the front and centre at certain times, and always in there somewhere, is the AIF, and of course the pretty new Royal Australian Navy, and so forth. So that's the nature of the book, and it's my third book, and my wife keeps reminding me in a tone that has to be taken note of that it's also my last. And to which I smile and respond, well, yeah, more or less. But arithmetic wasn't my forte, so maybe there's a fourth book in me somewhere, but I'm wondering. So enough of that. Defying, the theme today then is Defying the Kaiserreich, Australia's epic struggle and its purpose. Now, Kaiserreich is another name, and it's a standard name used in English history and literature. Kaiserreich is another name for Imperial Germany. The Kaiser, of course, simply meant, it comes from the German word for emperor, and Kaiserreich means the Kaiser's realm. So what I want to start, it might seem like I'm starting way back, but what was the nature of this Kaiserreich? It was the new Imperial Germany, which came after decades of failed efforts by progressive Germans to unite all their little realms into one grand German nation state. So the birth of Imperial Germany was hailed by many as the finest achievement of modern European nationalism. It wasn't the first, of course, if you recall the unification of Italy and so forth, but it was hailed as supposedly the finest, the biggest, the best achievement of modern European nationalism. From its very start in 1871, this unified Germany was the leading economic, industrial and military power of the continent. Previously, Germany was just a cultural region of 39 separate sovereign units, ranging from tiny city-states to no less than 6 kingdoms, including the top dog, Austria, whose dominance was resented by the northeastern kingdom, large northeastern kingdom, Prussia, whose army, many of you will know, whose army in 1815 had played a strong part in the Waterloo campaign alongside Britain to ensure the final downfall of Napoleon. In the post-Napoleonic reshaping of Europe's borders, Prussia did well, and although it was a northeastern kingdom, it was awarded 2 West German states in the Rhineland. The idea at the time was they would be there as a blocker in case there's any more trouble from those French. But fate played a hand here, because the areas that they were given and were to become part of Prussia they included the Ruhr, which within decades would be, of course, the heartland of Germany's rapid industrialisation. So by the 1850s, Prussia had the economic as well as the demographic and the military strength to support its ambitions. And then, talking of ambitions, it gained in Otto von Bismarck, a gifted leader who within 9 years united all the German states under Prussian leadership. With shrewd diplomacy and a first-rate army, he used brilliant military victories, particularly over Russia and even France, to achieve changes that eventually drew in all the German states, except Austria, which he banished from his new Germany, but otherwise treated very leniently in order to gain a solid ally some years later. By 1871, Bismarck, this Iron Chancellor, had made Prussia's king the Kaiser of United Germany, built around Prussia itself, which possessed most of the best German industry and 61% of all Germany's land and population. But Bismarck's formula for Germany's future provided a dangerous foundation. The nation's booming industries and the splendid potential of its people were now trapped inside the obsolete political framework of Prussia, which was an ultra-conservative kingdom. Germany's pro-democratic liberals were now on the back foot. They'd been so blinded by Bismarck's dazzling victories that they found themselves all too late stuck with an authoritarian, illiberal, anti-democratic form of government. Bismarck, of course, a clever fellow, gave it some progressive window dressing. When this was all complete in 1871, in a propaganda triumph, he made Germany the first power in the world to give all adult males the vote. And when I was at school, that was still fooling the writers of textbooks, who thought that that this was a wonderful feather in their cap. That Bismarck, all those decades later, was still fooling people because he gave them the vote, all right, but for what? He gave them a vote which populated a large building, parliamentary building called the Reichstag, which was not what we would consider to be a valid parliament. It was a glorified debating club. It did not the kind of citizens' parliament from which an elected government with a prime minister and a cabinet who've already had to be elected emerges. It wasn't that at all. Bismarck's new Reichstag was really a democratic fig leaf which covered the crude realities of power, which were, for example, an unelected chancellor or prime minister, unelected ministers chosen by and answering only to the Kaiserreich, who also appointed all senior officials, judges, generals, admirals, and diplomats. The appointees were usually Prussian nobles, Junkers, who, as an elite group, comprised the Prussian militarist oligarchy that really ran and would always run the Kaiserreich. Meanwhile, from 1871 to 1890, Bismarck strove to ensure that his Germany, created by the sword, would not die by it. What he'd won in battle, he needed to keep. He needed a peaceful continent now in which Germany could flourish. So the former poacher became the gamekeeper of Europe. He led 2 Berlin conferences that settled very awkward international issues, and he welcomed good relations with everyone except the French. In their 1870-71 war, he had shelled Paris, extorted a fortune in gold, and walked off with the provinces of Alsace-Lorraine. France would never forget, but he kept it isolated from any potential allies. Later, he made the first pre-1914 military alliance with Austria-Hungary, which now had a bitter feud with Russia. And Bismarck wanted to exercise some restraint in Vienna. He also, however, nurtured good relations with the Russians and even made a secret pact with them. And after that, like a dedicated bigamist, he pursued a demanding policy of keeping both Vienna and St. Petersburg as happy as possible. The serious trouble, however, started in 1890. Bismarck was dismissed by the new 31-year-old Kaiser, Wilhelm II, and Germany's foreign policy began its long slide into the abyss. The young Kaiser didn't understand Bismarck's diplomacy. He just hated being in the great man's shadow. So he dropped the pilot and he told the country he would now be steering and, quote, "I shall lead you to glorious days." Tragedy had put him on the throne in such a fateful era. His liberal father Friedrich, at 56, died of cancer after a reign of only 99 days. This ruined the last hope of improving liberal values in Germany and moderating both its militarism and its autocracy. Instead, the impulsive Wilhelm stepped up to rule personally and actively. The powers he wielded were almost medieval. He could appoint or dismiss any chancellor, minister, official, or general, or admiral, direct foreign policy, and even declare war. In some tiny little city-state, he might have been harmless, but as Kaiser, Wilhelm II was a catastrophe. This supreme commander of a formidable army, equipped by Europe's best industry and technology, was also a psychologically unstable person, addicted to strutting around in one of his countless uniforms and frequently expressing warlike desires and intentions. Now, there's no doubt that once Wilhelm got into his stride and showed everyone what he was like, making blunder after blunder in pursuit of naval and colonial and European glory, a substantial minority, millions of Germans, were bitterly disappointed with the outcome of German unification. Not that they wanted to revert to their 39 quaint little states, but they had hoped for a much fairer and a much better Germany. One sign of this was the 1912 election, Reichstag election, for which many parties, well into double figures, contended. One of them was a non-Marxist, non-revolutionary party which stood for social justice to be achieved peacefully and gradually by liberal constitutional methods. This party was the SPD, Social Democrats, and they alone in that election won, despite all those parties, won 34% of the vote. So close to the First World War, here is this peaceful democratic party in Germany getting 34% of the vote, which would get you a fair way in today's democratic politics. But to no avail. Ever since 1871, the Emperor and his Prussian militarist elite had an iron grip on this new Germany. And once Bismarck was gone, things got worse. The new Kaiser displayed that mix of impulsive folly, militarism, and foolish outbursts which caused enormous problems. For example, with his ill-disguised loathing of Russians, he trashed Bismarck's policy towards Russia, and this, in the strategic context, drove Russia straight into the arms of France, so that by 1894, there was a firm, official Franco-Russian military alliance, exactly what Bismarck had always managed to avoid. And Wilhelm, as if blameless for this outcome, took to complaining that he was now unfairly encircled by a hostile alliance. But it was the well-founded fear of that Kaiser with his invincible army which had driven his eastern and his western neighbours to take out this insurance against him. In such ways, Wilhelm continued to cause no end of trouble, and it was not limited to Europe. In the overseas world, while a freshly united Germany focused on its own context, other Europeans had embarked on a massive new drive to enlarge their empires and gain new colonies. In 1871, you may recall that about 10%, in 1871, about 10% of Africa had been colonised by Europeans. By 1902, however, that figure was 90%. 90% of the African continent had been colonised, and the Germans, with great speed and energy, had belatedly joined in the rush. In the 1880s, they got to Africa just in time to acquire a west and a southwest and a southeast colony in Africa. And in the Pacific Ocean, Kaiserreich had also acquired a great central band of big island groups running from north of the equator right down to a broad swathe of South Pacific possessions. Close to Australia, there was Kaiser Wilhelm's land. What else would it be called? With its capital at the great natural harbour of Rabaul, it included all the islands of the Bismarck archipelago and the northeast quarter of New Guinea itself. Reaching further east, Germany had claimed the Solomon Islands, Bougainville, and many others all the way across to Samoa. Australians soon noted that the Kaiserreich's acquisitions included a 3,000 kilometre cordon of islands marking the northern boundary of the Coral Sea. A little later, this chain of islands would be given powerful, very powerful wireless stations linked ultimately right through to Berlin, but more immediately linked to Admiral Graf von Spee's Pacific Cruiser Force. Even before shedding its colonial status in 1901, therefore, Australia really seemed to have already its own regional security policy. German power in the Pacific. What was the purpose of these strenuous German efforts to own so many Pacific island groups? Was it just national prestige? Well, that was certainly very much a German motive, and there was nothing particularly suspicious about that, because prestige was one of the motives that was behind every major colonising power in that period from 1870 through to World War I. But another motive was profit, obviously, and it was very hard to detect any profit being made in Germany's Pacific colonies, and in fact that was because they were operating at a serious loss. So why were the Germans so widely dispersed, especially in the South Pacific? Was it part of a long-term plan to compete with the British, or maybe take them down a peg or two in some way? The conduct of the Kaiser, who was deeply jealous of Britain's empire and its navy, suggested such thoughts well before 1901. As early as 1893, in fact, Queensland, ignoring colonial procedure, colonised Papua, including Port Moresby, mainly to deny the Germans a base on Torres Strait. In 1898, the Kaiser's favourite obsessive battleship man, Admiral von Tirpitz, launched an enormous and foolish attempt to outbuild Britain's Royal Navy. The result was the so-called Anglo-German naval race, or navy building race, which was financially and strategically disastrous for the Kaiserreich. In both Britain and Australia, it only fueled a more distinct suspicion and dislike of Germany. Perhaps it was mooted. The Kaiserreich had ideas of seizing Britain's Pacific colonies, or even Singapore. Or perhaps Australia and New Zealand, being both prestigious and profitable colonies, perhaps they were already seen as the potential jewel in the crown of a greater German South Pacific empire. Today, all this sounds to most people as far-fetched as one of those ripping British spy novels that came out in the years just before World War I. But the Kaiserreich's, interestingly, the Kaiserreich's own archives have survived, and they include Germany's pre-1914 naval and foreign office records, and those include reports and files from Germany's Consul General in Sydney. And here's one of the many little gems in this invaluable source from the German Consul General in Sydney. In 1912, the consul himself, an accredited diplomat, he obviously part-time when it came to being diplomatic, I think, reminded his superiors in Berlin that Australia was, quote, one of the most glittering prizes which could be won in the coming war. That's what he wrote back to Berlin, and that is typical of a number of things that went back in his reports. Now this man was not some lone enthusiast. If time permits, I'll say a bit more later about the German naval espionage network, which operated in all major Australia ports via 7 German consulates. They had one in Newcastle as well, for over a decade, up to 1914. Excuse me if I just repeat that, because you wonder if I've gone mad perhaps, but there was a German naval espionage network operating in Australia for more than a decade before World War I. It operated in all of our major ports. It sent its material through 7 German consulates. It operated for over a decade, up to 1914. We'll get to how we know this in a moment. But that was what was going on, and of course, certain mercantile marine people, all German citizens, by the way, and we are not talking about Australians of German descent. Everyone involved in this was a German citizen, with no plans to ever stay here, unless of course it became German. So some of the mercantile marine people and the 7 consuls were bound to come under some kind of suspicion. But neither they nor their network were ever detected, which is why, if you've ever heard of this, I'll be pleasantly surprised, because it has not been put out in the open. This outfit was called the Kriegsnachrichtenwesen, War Intelligence System, and what it collected went to the commander, who happened to be that same Sydney Consul General. He sent it on to Admiral von Spee's cruiser force in the Pacific, and to the Foreign Office and the Admiralty in Berlin. For the expected war, von Spee would need the best and the latest information for his so-called cruiser war on Australia and New Zealand. Australia's cargo ships, sea lanes, coastal defences, ports, even coastal cities, and the big oceanic exports like the wheat shipments were all his intended targets. This isn't guessed at, this is in the documents. And if fortune smiled, the cruisers might also sink even a troop ship or a single Australian warship. The overall purpose of all this was to stop or delay Australia's high seas exports to Britain, to ruin or disrupt our whole war effort as far as possible, to paralyse sea lanes and ports and create chaos in our industries and our cities. This is clear from the conscientious reports, planning, papers and files that went safely back to the fatherland. They have been, and they still can be, seen, read and copied in the archives of today's transformed Germany. None of this was known here at the time. So, while having no such knowledge or hard evidence in the years 1902 to 14, did the Australian Commonwealth have reason to regard Germany's Pacific power with deep misgivings? Yes. The competent naval and strategic analysts at the time were answering yes, Australia had good reason, because the signs and the realities were alarming. These included the Kaiser's conduct and alarming statements, and his headlong pursuit of this battleship program, which, as Tippett said, would empower your Majesty to carry out a great overseas policy, which was known as Weltpolitik. The trouble was, no one knew quite what it meant, except that the Kaiser was determined to take Germany far beyond its place, its current place, as the continent's leading power. He wanted to take it far beyond that, to make it a mighty world power, for which, of course, a navy with a global range was a necessity. And the underlying logic of all this was that if the Kaiser's aims could be achieved at all, this could only happen at the expense of Britain and the British Empire. And that, in our hemisphere, implied a straightforward threat to the newly federated Australia, for whom belonging in the Empire and being Australia were two sides of the same coin. And today, of course, the evidence from the Kaiserreich's records and many other German sources fully vindicates Australia's pre-1914 assessments of the possible danger. In all these circumstances, our new Australian Commonwealth, in just its first and second decades, found itself engaged in various forms of local and international opposition to the Kaiserreich, long before the AIF came into being, long before its historic campaign against the German army in Europe. Australians had defied the Kaiserreich on our own doorstep. So we're talking about now about stages in the process of defying the Kaiserreich. Defying the Kaiserreich was a non-violent affair, of course, for almost 25 years before 1914. First, of course, shortly after 1890 came Queensland's move to occupy Papua and forestall any German ability to get itself based on Torres Strait. Initially, from London, there was some very sniffy disapproval of what our banana benders had gone ahead and done, but that was all sorted out in 1894. Papua was proclaimed a British protectorate, and a decade later, it became Australia's own territory. In New Guinea, therefore, before 1900, we shared a wild colonial boundary or border with the Kaiserreich. Our second act of defiance, Our second act of defiance was inspired by a couple of British strategists and several Australian strategists, including, in a sense, Alfred Deakin, nicknamed Affable Alfred for his courteous manner, which, however, concealed some genuine steel. Australia moved away from a practice of subsidising British warships, which New Zealand continued, moved away to the policy of creating our own fleet unit, and that was called from 1911 on the Royal Australian Navy. Meantime, Deakin had wisely hastened the construction of this fleet unit's flagship, HMAS Australia. This battle cruiser, only a short step down from a dreadnought, was one of the best deterrents in our history. Its mighty guns and their 15-kilometre range were too much for Von Spee's cruisers. Writing to his wife, Von Spee grumbled that HMAS Australia was, quote, such a superior opponent that it must be avoided. And it was avoided. When war began, Spee left behind just one light cruiser, the Emden, which, as of course, as a disguised raider, did spectacular damage for 2 months in South Asian waters before being destroyed by one of our troop convoy's escort ships, HMAS Sydney. But Spee's cruiser force had left the Pacific, sailed to South America, sank 2 ageing Allied warships, and then met its doom at the Falkland Islands. All right, the third case, Australia's third clear act of defying the Kaiserreich, occurred only 5 weeks after the war began. It included our first armed clash with Germans, and it happened not far away, but right on our own perimeter. In an amphibious operation at Rabaul, Australians wrecked the great inland wireless facility and forced the German authorities to surrender the whole of Kaiser Wilhelm's land and all of those archipelagos in due course. With von Spee's cruisers missing, but no one knew where, no naval battle had occurred, although the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force, ANMEF, was led by the battle cruiser and most of our new fleet unit, just in case von Spee came back. But there was action of a very different kind and a very curious sort, and I have queried these tactics in Kaiserreich because I've queried them because the tactics used really make you scratch your head, and they were passed over in two separate accounts in the official history. On the surface, what happened was bizarre. About 1,000 Australian soldiers were peacefully disembarking at Rabaul, while 20 to 30 kilometres down the shoreline, two separate groups of our sailors, later joined by a handful of soldiers, were sent up two separate jungle tracks to find the wireless facilities. On one of these tracks, at Bitter Parker, an exotic Australian force won a sharp jungle fight to take the wireless base and the surrender of its garrison, including some rather confused German officers. There were 10 Australian casualties in that fight, including 6 killed, and I'm sure there's more than one gentleman in this room that knows that the first man to be killed in Australian uniform in that situation was a young man who was in the Royal Australian Navy. So so we had 10 casualties. The enemy took an awful lot more, but only confusion on the enemy's side avoided a lot more Australian losses. In this Bitter Parker, there was a lot of confusion all around in this business. In this Bitter Parker fighting, when on our side reinforcements were urgently sent for, the only people available were more sailors who were the crew of a destroyer, and they were bundled off the destroyer and sent up the track with few suitable weapons. The majority, lacking rifles, looked more like a cast of Caribbean pirates as they advanced up the track, armed with cutlasses. The ship's cook, indeed, was the complete Long John Silver look-alike, with his rolled-up apron, his pistol, and his cutlass. But a little later, the objective was quite cleverly, in spite of this difficulty with weapons, the objective was cleverly taken by some bluff and quick thinking, and with minimal Australian casualties. After that Rabaul action, the whole ANMEF task force was commanded no longer by the flagship's admiral, but by an experienced and cool soldier called Holmes, Colonel Holmes. He of, I don't know which direction it is standing here, he of General Holmes Drive, who later led an AIF division in France. His task after Rabaul was to shut down the German island bases in the Southwest Pacific and set up occupation arrangements. So we come to the fourth, and of course the most familiar and the biggest case of Australia defying the Kaiserreich, and this began with the decision to raise and to send the AIF volunteers on their historic journey to Europe. You know, it was an historic journey, and nothing much has ever been made of this, but there's a lot of people in the Western world who are still familiar, or could easily become familiar via Google in 5 minutes, of the story of the Iliad, so many thousands of years ago, and that is the grand story of the of the original. That is the grand story and adventure of, if you like, the origins of the West. And yet the Greek soldiers who went off to Troy, which of course is very close to Gallipoli, those Greek soldiers who went off there probably only travelled on average about 300 kilometres, and here you have in the early 20th century a very large force of Australian, together with New Zealanders, Australian volunteers, literally crossing the world, which has begun to greatly interest French historians lately, and that's an expression they use. You know, why did these Australians cross the world to come and fight here with us? And this, of course, was the start of this greatest act of defying the Kaiserreich. The diggers were, of course, as you know, diverted to Gallipoli, which delayed their first encounter with German troops until early 1916. Now, casualties and conditions on Gallipoli, we know, were awful. But had the AIF gone into the line against Germany by early 1915, their experience could well have been twice as bad. To simply illustrate that point, it so happens that on the very day that the AIF landed at Anzac Cove, a Canadian division at Ypres in the little pocket of Belgium, was bearing the brunt of the war's first heavy gas attack on the same day, 25 April. It was unexpected. They had no masks or respirators. Other units on both flanks cleared out, but somehow those Canadians managed to hold the line and stop the German advance. And the only thing anyone could think of, and it was better than nothing, was to get out a big handkerchief if you had one, or unwind your puttees and urinate on them and breathe through that. But that's the kind of thing that was happening to our Dominion cousins on the same day as the landing at Anzac. Well, at least the AIF was spared that horror at the time. But once they did get to France, as we know, they were spared little else. One thing they were spared in a broader context at the outset and throughout the war was the sinking of any Anzac troopship in the Indian Ocean convoys. Over 425,000 Australian and New Zealand troops would make this historic voyage in safety, thanks to the failure of the Kaiserreich's global and naval strategies, and the successful creation of Australia's fleet unit as well, which had sailed from British shipyards and trials to Sydney Harbour by October 1913, to be greeted by delighted Sydney crowds who were amazed when the mightiest ship that had ever entered the harbour was there in front of them, not far from where we are now. And that was, of course, the battle cruiser HMAS Australia, a brand new ship leading a brand new fleet unit, and there they were in Sydney Harbour. It's also probable, apart from all the delighted Australians looking on, it's also probable that some reliable person from the German consulate, and separately a few members of the Kriegsmark-Richten Basin, also witnessed the arrival of this new state-of-the-art and quite strong naval force. Admiral von Spee soon heard about it, and he knew what it would probably mean. Unless, when war started, unless these Royal Australian Navy ships were immediately sent straight across to join Britain's Grand Fleet, unless that happened, if they stayed in Australian waters, they would completely ruin his plan to cripple Australia's war effort. Well, with the raising of the AIF and the huge intake of volunteers during 1915, and the safe continuation of all the convoys and shipping, Australia's ultimate defiance of the Kaiserreich at the Western Front was set to become the most formidable military campaign in our history. There can be little doubt about that assessment of the first AIF's place in Australia's history. And in these words from the Oxford Companion to Australian Military History, you might well recognise a classic form in which this has been expressed. From 1916 to 1918, Australian forces, for the first time in their history, engaged the main army of the main enemy in the main theatre of war. We only need to add here that that main army being, of course, the essentially the strongest elements of the German army, faced by the AIF, was surely the most formidable army in the world. Consider this, even though Germany had relied heavily on winning the war very quickly in 1914, this didn't happen, but Germany coped so well with the failure of its own plan that within 3 years, with only mediocre support from one ally on the continent, it not only beat off the French and British Empire armies, it inflicted on Russia colossal defeats and disastrous retreats until by late 1917 it had shattered the Russian Empire, it had shattered Russia's war effort, and it had won the war on the Eastern Front. So this was no mean opponent for the relatively small Australian force alongside of all of its empire cousins and our large ally, the French, who had 100 divisions. This was no mean opponent. Now, as the year 1916 struggled to finish another winter and creep into March and the European springtime, the AIF was on its way to the Western Front, at last across the Mediterranean, where it would retrain to fight in different, worse and more lethal conditions. Despite that message, the Australians hoped and intended, no matter what anyone told them, they hoped and intended to make their mark. Most of them had sailed from an Egypt they were glad to leave, after taking in huge reinforcements there in Egypt and being reorganised into 4 divisions. Another fresh formation, known officially as the 3rd Division, was still training in England under Monash and would become the last of the 5 Australian divisions to reach France at a later stage in 1916. Spring 1916 would soon give way to the cruel summer of 1916, which from the 1st of July, you'll recall, was supposed to witness the initial victory and the great advance of the British Army in Sir Douglas Haig's Battle of the Somme. Instead, we know what happened on the terrible 1st of July, when advancing British infantry were cut down by machine gunners who weren't supposed to have survived the preliminary British artillery. But that artillery had been retargeted and uselessly dispersed by none other than Haig himself. Now, this isn't gratuitous Haig bashing. One of the top First World War historians working in the English language, Professor Gary Sheffield in England, he is a great admirer of Haig. He has published a biography of Haig, which to me is just far too kind, to say the least, to Haig in case after case. But even in that context, even in that sort of book, even Gary Sheffield says straight out, this is the way that Haig interfered with his battle commander's arrangement of the artillery and his artillery chief's disposal of it. This is how Haig interfered. He retargeted the artillery force he had and uselessly dispersed it. Even Gary Sheffield says that, and that is the reason why those German machine gunners were in position when they should not have been, and that was why that terrible slaughter happened in the first hour of the advance on the 1st of July and continued until there were approximately 60,000 casualties. Australians, New Zealanders and Canadians were lucky that they weren't included in the first day, and neither were any other overseas troops, with the sole exception of the very unfortunate Newfoundland Regiment, which took 90% casualties. But the Somme was a 5-month battle, and all too soon the Dominion troops would be called on, and sometimes every one of them, in terms of different nations, every one of them would find themselves in positions that weren't much better. It has been rightly said that before 1918 on the Western Front, the manpower of all armies on both sides was repeatedly squandered in poorly planned and badly executed battles, which gained very little at a terrible price. This is what the Australians were about to find out for themselves, but it must be remembered that all of General Haig's troops, English, Scots, Welsh, Irish, Indians, South Africans, New Zealanders, Canadians, all of them went through the terror and the horror which were the essence of fighting in France and Flanders. That was just as true for the Germans, and certainly the French, whose ability to keep fighting in that 1916 nightmare of Verdun is almost unbelievable, and for every national contingent in Haig's British and Empire Army. Nonetheless, what the AIF went through, and most notably from mid-July 1916 to mid-1917, was an almost continuous series of battlefield horrors made even more infernal by the growing realisation that they were going through battle after battle in which superb courage and skill were not enough, for two reasons, which we'll see. And I was going to refer briefly to those 6 battles, beginning chronologically with Fromelles, the 19th of July, which of course is known, among other things, because it was the worst single day's carnage in our history. Happened under the dubious leadership of Sir Richard Hacking. The next 5 battles all happened within the army of Sir Hubert Gough, a bold cavalry commander who unfortunately was lifted out of the cavalry and made an infantry general by Haig, and this worked out to be a terribly bad idea. He was disastrously unsuitable in that role, and so the Australians pretty soon were cursing their luck to find themselves in his army for battle after battle, all of them ill-conceived actions which Gough was very proud to have thought up. And so the exception is the opening battle at Pozieres, and the Australians had really put themselves on the map in a sense by taking Pozieres when previous attempts by others had failed. That would have been a disaster as well if our first division's general, Walker, who was English and a very fine general, if he had not had the backbone to stand up to Gough, that would have been a disaster as well. As soon as he got there, Gough rushes straight up to him and says, "I want you to go into the line tomorrow and attack Pozieres." And he said, "My troops aren't even here yet, and this is impossible. We don't know where anything is. I haven't seen the plans, etc., etc." And he, in the nicest possible way, I suppose, he just kept on giving him reason why it couldn't happen, and Gough had to back away. When Walker saw the plans, he discovered that if the Australians had gone forward on the original plan, they would have been shelled by the British. That's the kind of planning that Gough's people did time and again. However, that was fortunately a success, but Pozieres Crest, which went straight on from there, late July, early August, Mouquet Farm, absolute madness from the 8th of August to the 5th of September. And then I'm jumping over the winter time, but the winter in other ways was a ghastly time for Australians, and it took a lot of casualties, which were the fault not of the Germans but of General Winter and the situation they were placed in. That winter was the worst winter for 40 years, and most days the temperature didn't rise to freezing point. But passing over that, and of course then the last 2 absolute Gough specialties were the first and second battles of Bullecourt, which again are just plain madness, and I have got a fairly detailed account of the one-day battle, first Bullecourt here, and it just beggars belief that anyone with half a brain could have thought that what he wanted them to do could possibly work, except to the great pleasure of the German defenders. But I must move on quickly here. In fact, I've got to be careful or time will defeat me. But as I said, there were the Australians in all of from the start and throughout all of these dreadful, hopelessly planned battles, were finding out that no matter how much, no matter how good their morale, no matter how well they worked together, no matter what courage and skill they undoubtedly had, it wasn't enough. I said there were two reasons why this was the case. Well, the first one is about generalship. Now, in the 1960s, I can recall that World War I British general bashing was a popular sport in both Britain and Australia, and probably in other places too, and a good deal of it was exaggerated, and half the people repeating this didn't know any of the real facts or anything like that. But okay, a lot of that's been straightened out, and the nonsense has been put to one side. But when it's put to one side, what's still left is very bad. So one of the reasons why courage and skill and every other quality that the Australian troops showed was not enough. One of the reasons was, more often than not, the captaincy, the generalship. It would certainly, in terms of the casualties, it would certainly have made a huge difference if, instead of the hackings and the Goths and even the Hagues, when we get to Passchendaele, that's Hague's, that's all his own work. It would have made a very substantial difference if, instead of that sort of generalship, all the troops, the Tommies and the Empire troops and so forth, all of them, it would have made an enormous difference if men of superior intelligence and flexible and broader minds and potential for innovation and problem solving had been in charge. Unfortunately, Hague kept his position to the end, and although he was clever enough to be seen welcoming things like tanks, that was window dressing too. He was incorrigible in terms of the way he wanted to fight this, and simply hadn't got his mind out of the 19th century. And we've got classic evidence for this in his letters. He wrote to the Chief of the Imperial General Staff and said, on one occasion, and said that when this initial attack, whichever one it was, had broken through, he was going to use his cavalry along the lines of 1806. What he was talking about was Napoleon's brilliant, crushing defeat of the Prussians by a huge and superior cavalry force in 1806. And here he was still thinking, this is I think 1917. He's still thinking that this is what it's all about. All this other nonsense is just to make a hole so he can put the cavalry through, and just couldn't get his mind into a different era. But okay, that was one of the reasons. But the other reason is a harder one. The other reason why all the Australians' courage and skill and commitment and morale and so forth, and the same for other armies and nationalities of very similar abilities. The reasons why these were just not enough on the Western Front was that even if you had the smartest general in the world, if people of the skill, you think of the skill we know that Monash was able to demonstrate, and the terrific intelligence and so forth that he was able to demonstrate in 1918. But if all of the major generals in the British Empire's army and other armies had been that good, the trouble is, earlier in the war, when the artillery wasn't that good and there wasn't enough of it and so forth, they would have struggled as well, because, as one of them said, no matter what you do, one of the good French generals said, no matter what you do, you lose a lot of men. Because, yeah, it seems like an understatement, doesn't it? But but he was answering somebody who seemed to be overlooking this, because no matter what you did, you couldn't get around the fact that this was an industrial and mechanical war, in which infantry could no longer expect to play their traditional role, and they could not survive if they were expected to do the attacking and make the breakthroughs and tear open the holes, as Ludendorff put it. You just could not be expected to make the attacks and tear open the holes, because those terrible machines, above all those thousands of guns, were just going to inflict another slaughter. Only artillery, lots of it, cleverly made and cleverly used, was eventually going to get over this problem. And even then, as they put it, you still lost a lot of men. Now, if I might just quickly conclude by coming back to the initial theme. To finish on a positive note with regard to the Australians in the field, of course, as already referred in passing to Monash, leading, giving the AIF the leadership it always deserved to have, and Monash certainly was the man who had the capacity, on top of which circumstances and weaponry and everything else by this stage were there for him to use, and that combination was a great one, and it allowed the Australians to show what they could do when they were finally given a good sporting chance. And that great corridor of victories up the Somme Valley and to Mont-Saint-Quentin, and above all, and finally, of course, to that critically timed breaking of the Hindenburg line. These were contributions by the AIF, while similar ones were being made by the Canadians, by the British, and so forth. These were contributions, wonderful contributions made by the AIF, not just to breaking the Hindenburg line, but to breaking the Kaiserreich. So from the Coral Sea to the Hindenburg line, Australia had defied the Kaiserreich. The AIF, the RAN, and countless other Australian men and women all played their part in this. We should conclude by reminding ourselves of their purpose, of the reasons why so many Australians were prepared to give their all in this country's most epic struggle. And you don't have to be a philosopher to work it out. I drove up here from the south coast and I went through a little village called Bamboka, and I love going past this little memorial. It's a simple one, but it's a memorial to the men who are named on it, who left this district to fight for liberty and justice in the Great War. And when all the arguments are dealt with, that is what they did. They were fighting more than they knew to keep this country, to keep their country's freedom, and to defend it against the likes of those curious neighbours just up north, about whom they knew very little. Thank you very much.
We've got some time for questions. Anyone will have a question?
You mentioned the German spy.